Well, hi, everybody. We're just going to launch right into the breaking news as it sits before us on this Monday morning as we move into another day of conflict in the Middle East. And I'm using that word very carefully because some will describe this as war, others will describe what we're seeing as an attack, others may use conflict. And we're in that sort of stage where we're still figuring out what exactly we're in for. Early on Saturday morning, many of us woke up stateside to the news that the US and Israel has attacked Iran. We've seen a variety of different reports over the last 48 hours. We're still sifting through some of these reports to figure out what's what. And we have some brand new information from the Pentagon this morning that we're going to work through with you. As you're probably also trying to get your hands around the news, you're going to hear a lot of different perspectives, and different perspectives are important. Sometimes it's difficult to know who to trust in these situations. And there's a lot of different voices and a lot of different opinions. Many, if not most of these voices have never been to Iran, have never stepped foot in that country. But our friend Holly McKay has, war correspondent and writer. Many have not traveled extensively across the Middle East, but Holly McKay has. And many have not reported through conflicts, come face to face with terrorists, have seen up close what war looks like. Holly McKay has. And that's why Holly McKay is here. For those of you who are just meeting her for the first time, she may be a new face for many of us on Smarter News. She's a familiar face because we met during America's withdrawal in Afghanistan when Holly was in the country then. She did incredible reporting at that time. And now we've become friends. We became friends because of conflict, actually, Holly. I know that's probably not unusual in your life, but we did. We forged a friendship during this time that's been enduring. And it's so great to be able to have your perspective during moments like this.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to divide this broadcast up as organized as we possibly can. We have the new news from the Pentagon. As I mentioned, the Department of War had a press briefing today that was important and gave us some new information. We're going to work through that. Then we're going to work through some of the critiques of what the United States is doing, a different perspective. So we have some balance. And then we're also going to rely on some of Holly's personal stories from traveling inside Iran, something that she did in 2017 that many have not done. She has a couple of really fabulous stories that we've shared before, but deserve to be highlighted yet again. Before I get to some of the news from the Pentagon, I do want to mention this. We do have some brand new information from the New York Times and brand new reporting. As many of you also know, there was a shooting in Austin, not far from where I live here in Texas. And the shooting is being investigated as a terrorist attack. If it is confirmed as a terrorist attack, it could be the first incident in the country where we've seen a terrorist attack response to what is happening regarding Iran. So I really want everybody to know that's part of the weight of this story. It's in addition to those who were killed and those injured by the shooter that shot into a very crowded area in Austin about 2 o'clock in the morning on Sunday morning. We have one of the victims who was identified, a 19-year-old college student. The victim, Ryder Harrington, was confirmed by his father to the New York Times in a brief phone call just a few moments ago. So we're going to learn the identities of the victims. This is one. We know there's another one as well. This was an area of a lot of young people. And the story matters because of the loss of life. And as we're looking at the cost of conflict, we can include what happens here at home as well. And the question about how far this conflict extends is one of the questions we're going to talk about today. Because right now we're pointing towards the Middle East and our focus is there, but we don't want to lose focus at what's happening at home and the ties to the story that also exists. So that's still under investigation, admittedly so, but I wanted to share that news, that unfortunate news for the family. So I know so many of you think about the victims and these particular stories, and it feels cliche to say your thoughts and prayers, but I know you think about them, and I want you to know when we do know who they are because their lives matter. As we're taking in that information, we do have some brand new information from the Pentagon. I'm going to play some sound here, and then we're going to talk about what this means and why this was newsworthy on the other side.
Two questions for you. The president said yesterday in his video message that we will leave Iran when we complete all of our objectives. What are our objectives? And can you share more information on how the soldiers who were killed were killed?
Well, I laid out the objectives. as did the chairman. They're completely nested. I mean, Iran has an ability to project power against us and our allies in ways that we can't tolerate. So whether that's ballistic missiles and drones, so offensive capabilities, effectively their Navy, which would attempt to set other terms and impose different costs, drone capabilities, which we laid out there. And ultimately, though, this tying it back to Midnight Hammer, the president has been willing to make a deal. You can't have a nuclear bomb. Radical Islamists can't have a nuclear bomb that they wield against the world. He gave them every single opportunity. Then we precisely took it away. And even then, after that, they didn't have that. They didn't come to the table with a willingness to give it away. So ultimately, those nuclear ambitions, which never ceased, are something that had to be addressed as well. So that's a discrete sense of what's being addressed to ensure that they can't use that conventional to continue a pursuit of nuclear ambitions. And then that particular incident was, you have air defenses, most of it, and we absolutely do. We have incredible air defenders. Every once in a while, you might have one, unfortunately, we call it a squirter that makes its way through. And in that particular case, it happened to hit a tactical operations center that was fortified, but these are powerful weapons. So we certainly will do, as I said, moments like that as we remember them and we take care of them and take care of their families, only stiffen our resolve to ensure that we do this properly.
So we don't know where exactly. We're still waiting for more information about what exactly transpired, how many other injuries we have for U.S. service members. But that's the first time that we heard on the record that this was a tactical operations center that was successfully hit by Iran, and that there have been now 4 service members who have been killed. But just a reminder, there are a set of other injuries that we don't really know, and we may not ever, quite frankly, know the extent of, which is always difficult in this type of reporting. I'm curious, Holly, what did you think of Secretary Haig's explanation there about why we're doing this? What are our objectives? What stood out most to you?
So I do think, obviously, it's sort of being framed as this sort of immediate sort of threat. And I tend to maybe disagree with that analogy a little bit. I know that justification has to be used in this particular situation, particularly because they didn't go through Congress and the usual kind of steps. But I do think that nevertheless, the Iranian threat is being very chronic and persistent, really, I mean, for decades now. And certainly there has been an abundance of evidence over the last decade of the Iranians, working toward building that nuclear bomb. I think the administration shot themselves in the foot a little bit last year when they said that they obliterated everything with those strikes in June. I don't think that was necessarily the case. I think that they probably sort of disabled a lot of their capabilities, but obliterated was probably not the right word to use. So I think Iranians were able to get back on their feet. They also had nuclear sites that weren't targeted in those June strikes. So I think that there is a lot of evidence to say that they were certainly working toward building a nuclear weapon, which would certainly be incredibly dangerous and destabilizing for the region as well. So I think there was reason certainly to attack Iran, maybe heightened on the eminent scale, but I certainly think that Iran, poses a big threat to United States interests. I think that is ultimately the menace of the Middle East. A lot of the conflicts that, have transpired in recent years there, Iran has sort of played a very large hand at, whether that's not always directly, but funding a lot of these militia groups, from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Hamas to a lot of these organizations. And then on the flip side, for years, they also have harbored leaders of Al-Qaeda, so even ones that aren't typically aligned with their sort of Shia resistance. Iran, anyone basically who is an enemy of the United States, is a friend to Iran. And so that is very problematic.
That's an important point, and that's one that's often been debated for years. Iran is a Shia Muslim country, and sometimes warranted. Listen, I love a little academic conversation. Don't get me wrong, but there's been a lot of debate in America about, what are Iran's real capabilities? Why are they an enemy? And I'm sure some in our audience also have that question today. Okay, they're a menace of the Middle East that you described, but Why does that impact us? How would you answer that question, Holly?
Well, I think that it impacts us because it is a direct threat to United States allies, basically everywhere in the world. And I think that if we just, I mean, you can always just go back to the days of the war in Iraq. And Iran was responsible for, I think it was 17% of all the deaths of American troops in Iraq. And that was maybe 600 and something. So, just in that, in of itself, it has a lot of blood on its hands. Is that justification for full war? Not exactly. But it sort of goes to show that Iraq's long been kind of at the backbone of every conflict that the US has somehow been involved in. And I think that there really, in my experience, no other country that has had that sort of power to kill, to disrupt. And it's not just, and, oftentimes these wars feel very isolated, but I do think it has to involve the United States because the United States is in the leadership position that it is in, but also Iran sort of sits at the conjecture of global trade, of oil, of everything. You've got the Strait of Hormuz right now, which is under threat. Ships are no longer being able to go through there. And that sort of accounts for 90% of a lot of the global trade, is this one kind of 2-mile wide strait that kind of passes between Iran and Oman. And right now that is not serviceable. So that is why we're going to see massive increases, in oil and the cost of goods. And, that is certainly can be considered a negative side of this war. But then we have to look at the other side of it, which is also that Iran effectively, its naval bases kind of had control to use this at will as well and take advantage and exploit at any given moment. So it just sort of where Iran sits makes it very strategically important for the rest of the world.
Yeah, interesting to put some of those puzzle pieces together. As you were talking, I was thinking about a spider web. And if we think about terrorism or mischief or our adversaries sort of as a web, if all of these different lines lead back to Iran, and you can start drawing lines between Russia and Iran and the exchange of military might and strategic information. You can draw a line between Iran and China for oil purchasing. You can draw a line between Iran and the previous leadership in Syria. I know you spent a lot of time there. Syria is also a designated state sponsor of terrorism by the United States. You can draw a line between Iran and Venezuela. You could draw a line between Iran and North Korea, another state sponsor of terrorism. You could draw a line between Iran and Hezbollah, the most militarized terrorist group in the world, in Lebanon, as far as organized and resourced. You can draw a line between Iran and Hamas, and Hamas's attack on Israel just a few years ago, a horrific attack, and funding Hamas's war that has continued via Israel. So there's all of these connections, but sometimes it's more difficult to draw that line back to the American citizen and say, this is why this matters. And that's what the entertainment of a world without this regime in Iran is such a news moment. Because if that leadership changes, then all of those lines start to change too. And we wake up into a new reality. What do you think is the significance of the death of the Ayatollah, Holly?
I think a lot of it is going to come down to whether it's the death of the regime or just the death of sort of the Ayatollah and the leaders kind of around him, because they do have, I believe, 3 or 4 layers of successes. For each person that was killed, they all already have 3 or 4 designated successors to immediately come in to take that place. So this is not, they do have contingency plans to be able to continue that regime. But I do think that the death of the Ayatollah is huge. And he, was very much the architect of a lot of these really unfathomable sort of human rights abuses that have happened over the years, and kind of carried the torch, I guess, from the Ayatollah before him. And so I just think, this has been decades coming. And honestly, some of the worst stories that I've ever had to cover or people that I've had to interview over the years have really emanated from this regime and what people have experienced, in these prisons.
Can you give us a few examples of that, Holly?
Yeah, I mean, during, and this was the Ayatollah before him, but there was a massacre in prisons in 1988 in Iran. So any dissidents, protesters that had kind of spoke out against this autocratic religious regime were thrown in jail. I mean, the executions themselves were just en masse, but the kind of torture that they put people through, women, where they would rape them before they killed them to, make sure that they were, I guess, defiled in some way, and just cutting off limbs. I mean, there was one man that I spoke with who, said among many of the awful things, they would make him eat his eyebrows, like just stuff that you really can't even start to process about how people can kind of get through that kind of horrific torture. And this never ended. This was something that just has continued for sort of decades and decades. And we saw again this year where just thousands, potentially tens of thousands of protesters that were killed. They were mowed down by these armored vehicles or shot or in whatever kind of means possible. So yes, you do have this regime that sort of pretending it wants to protect and defend itself and defend its people, but it's really done a bad job of protecting and defending its people over the years.
And as you point out, this is decades in the making. So one of those questions is why now? Why now? Why did we choose the end of February in 2026 for this to happen? And there's a lot of theories about this. It's actually a question, though, that one of our insiders had. Here's what Barbara sent to us this week.
Hey, Jenna, this is Barbara. I have a question in regards to Iran, which I think was one of the questions that you brought up on your podcast this weekend. And that is, how long have we known that this attack was going to happen? The reason I'm asking that is you brought up, is it possible that the president knew when he was giving the State of the Union? My question is, after watching some national news last night, I saw it noted that we had been tracking the Ayatollah for months. The CIA had been watching his movements, tracking where he was at when he was above ground and when he was below ground. If they've been tracking him for months, is it possible that this has been in the work for months?
Holly, what are your thoughts on that? It's a great question by Barbara. It's one that many of us had. You said that there was some reporting that definitely raise your antenna about this taking place sooner rather than later. Can you share some of your insight with us?
Yeah, so I think really since these protests really took heat right at the beginning of this year, and we know that President Trump came out and said help is on the way and really threatened the regime that he would take action if they didn't stop. And then it kind of went dead, which was a little bit, odd, because you sort of, what is happening? Is this Trump's red line that he doesn't act on? And whenever you say things in the Middle East, you just don't say anything unless you're willing to kind of back it up, because it's a very literal, I guess, society in some ways. And that was the big mistake that President Obama had made with, the chemical weapons in Syria were a red line, and that the U.S. was going to act. And so that was taken very literally by the Syrians, who, rose up and expected to be protected. And when that didn't happen, that was quite a blowback, I think. And one of the stains that I think has sort of persisted a little bit around President Obama's legacy. And so when Trump sort of made these very bold declarations and then sort of didn't immediately act on it, there was a little bit of head scratching. And, from people I know in the orbit, I guess, I do think that Trump did want to make a deal and was hoping that the Iranians would quickly come to the table and basically, surrender their nuclear arsenal. But of course, that is debatable to the Israelis in particular, and not for that agreement. They don't believe that the Iranians can be trusted in any way, shape, or form. They might say, yes, we'll get rid of the stockpile, but continue it, which is a little bit of what we have seen in the past. So I think really it came down to Trump still wanting to make a deal. I do think that there was sort of a strong push from Netanyahu, a big concern from his cabinet about what that deal would look like and what that would mean for the Israelis. And so I think the joint operation was sort of the approach that was taken. And of course, for weeks now, troops have been amassing in the region, and carriers have moved there. And so a huge amount of assets have moved to the region, and that takes time. So
Can I
that's sort of-
Can I pause you there,
Yeah.
Holly? Because listen to what General Kane said about
Yeah.
that, about the reason why they did this.
Mhm.
Barbara, I also flagged this for you. It's the same thing that I was thinking as your question, which is why now? And I thought General Kane's commentary here, it's short, it's just 30 seconds, was important.
So now to talk a little bit about setting the force and setting the theater. On the order of the Secretary of War over the last 30 days to reinforce deterrence and provide the president with credible options should action be required, the Joint Force began to systematically reposition assets and personnel across the region. These movements ensured that U.S. forces remained postured, protected, and ready to respond decisively for any emerging threat.
So I thought this was important, Holly, because he basically is saying, hey, we were ready, but it wasn't certain. But we meant it. So we're moving for the right posture, because if we're needed, we're going to go. And if we're not needed, then that's okay. But at least we've shown that we're prepped and ready. I thought that was kind of an interesting, thinking about the negotiations and how much it takes to move that amount of military to the Middle East, that provides some insight that there was a seriousness to the moment, even weeks in advance.
Yes, absolutely. And also that could have been interpreted and, as a pressure tactic, to try to get them to the table. You've got these assets around you, like hurry up and make a deal kind of thing. And I don't think that this was necessarily on the table for a week, weeks or months, but the options, I guess, needed to be there. And when the commander-in-chief is sort of, I guess, ready to take that option, that is obviously the decision that was made I think last week at some point to attack.
Well, and let's hear about, we're going to play the sound now that sort of reads a little bit like a movie. This is from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, again, General Kane, a key advisor to the president, highest ranking military officer in the country. Let's just listen to how he describes the moment that they actually received the order. And I want you to think about the timelines. Remember, the attack actually starts in the middle of the night here stateside, but early in the morning in Iran around 9 o'clock.
Let me move to H hour. At 3:38 p.m. on Friday, February 27th, the United States Central Command, through the Secretary of War, received the final go order from President Trump. The president directed, and I quote, "Operation Epic Fury is approved. No aborts. Good luck," close quote. In the region, every element of the Joint Force made their final preparations. Air defense batteries readied themselves, checking their systems to respond to Iranian attacks. Pilots and crews rehearsed their strike packages for the final time. Air crews began loading their final weapons, and 2 carrier strike groups began to move towards their launching points. Across the globe, our operations centers came alive in Tampa, Florida, here at the Pentagon, and of course forward in the Central Command AOR. As always, operational security was paramount as we sought to maintain and sustain the element of surprise. This operation was highly classified so that at H hour, the enemy would see one thing: speed, surprise, and violence of action. The first movers were U.S. Cybercom and U.S. Spacecom, layering non-kinetic effects, disrupting and degrading and blinding Iran's ability to see, communicate, and respond. At H hour, the beginning of major combat operations, 01:15 local Eastern Daylight Time, 9:45 local AM Tehran time, as dawn crept up across the Central Command AOR, the skies surged to life. More than 100 aircraft launched from land, sea, fighters, tankers, airborne early warning, electronic attack, bombers from the states, and unmanned platforms, forming a single synchronized wave. This was a daylight strike based on a trigger event conducted by the Israeli Defense Forces, enabled by the U.S. intelligence community. The first shooters at sea were Tomahawks unleashed by the United States Navy, closed in on Iranian naval forces, and began to conduct strikes across the southern flank in Iran. On the ground, forces fired precision standoff weapons, measured, deliberate, precise, and lethal. This was a massive, overwhelming attack across all domains of warfare, striking more than 1,000 targets in the first 24 hours.
The reason why I let that play a little longer is that we really don't have any idea of the coordination of exactly which targets are U.S. targets versus Israeli targets. And that gave us a little bit of an idea of how widespread this operation was, even thinking about Space Force and how space was involved in it. We're just at the very beginning of understanding what transpired over the last several hours. And that's why this press briefing really mattered, because it's the first time that we've heard any on the record comments from these high ranking military officials. Just to talk about a couple things that you heard, AOR is an area of responsibility. So just as you hear that acronym H hour, the H doesn't really mean anything in particular. H hour is almost stands for the H of hour, meaning that's the go time for this military operation to commence. And those comments from the president, Holly, just thinking about what that must have been like for our service members, no aborts, good luck.
Yeah.
What stands out most to you from what General Kane had to say there?
I think it just comes down to, for better or worse, what a sort of bold move. Again, many administrations have had a lot of beef with Iran, have certainly, I talked to somebody who ran the CIA desk in Iran for more than 3 decades yesterday. And he sort of said, look, like, this is something that has been an option for pretty much every administration, since 1979. But, it's everybody sort of looked at the option and said, no, thanks, except up until now. So again, it's hard to give it a really good assessment to say whether this, what is going to happen next? Was it worth it? There are so many questions that we can't answer yet, to put bluntly. And but we'll see as time goes, but it certainly just, what stands out is just the bold move of it. Just
the bold move. And also going back to Barbara's question, those are plans that you just don't spin up, in 24 hours. There's a lot of coordination that needs to take place, a lot of background to that. And who knows, some of those plans could predate the Trump administration. We don't exactly know all of that.
So typically, like a president, the military, the generals will present, 3 or 4 options to the president and say, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, you can do this. And without knowing, exactly, it certainly seems like he went for probably what I would think would be the most sort of extreme that was offered on the table.
The D option, the all of the above option, perhaps could have been that. I'll be very curious to understand what that was like. Just for a moment, then we're gonna hear from the foreign minister of Iran. We're gonna also hear from a critic of the president, because we want these voices in too. But because the nuclear negotiations have been at the center of so much different policy, I just want to pause there for a second, because I feel like these dots are not connected. So administrations over the years have negotiated with Iran to try to get them off the path of nuclear power. Not nuclear power that would be peaceful nuclear power, but peaceful nuclear energy, but this idea that they could create a nuclear weapon. And that's something that was terrifying to a lot of people because of their ties to terrorism. So one of the things you're going to hear is a comment about Iran supplying the technology for roadside bombs. And it cannot be said that, well, I should be careful with my language here. It has long been understood that most of the technology that we saw injure U.S. troops in Iraq from roadside bombs had links back to Iran. So I want you to think about how many people you've seen that have lost limbs because of roadside bombs or were killed because of it. I want you to think about if instead of roadside bombs, if Iran was exporting nuclear weapons, how different the world would look. We think about the drones that Iran has provided Russia, these unmanned drones that fly by the hundreds into Ukraine to just start bombing innocent people. Imagine if instead of those unmanned drones were carrying nuclear weapons. So this is where it's not just, it's sort of, we talk about these things sort of like separate things sometimes, Holly, like, okay, it's the nuclear negotiations here, and then there's the state sponsor of terrorism here, but sometimes we just don't connect them. And even though that's a hypothetical, I do think that's important to know that that's part of the conversation, is about not just Iran having a nuclear weapon, but because of their relationships, exporting it.
And I do think in the question I get, so much is, why does a certain conflict get a lot more attention than a different conflict? And, often the answer does come down to, nuclear weapons. If a nuclear power is involved in the conflict in any way, shape, or form, it is going to matter to the US a lot more. That's why, Russia, Ukraine is going to get a lot more attention than the absolute atrocities that are happening in Myanmar or in Congo, because Russia is a nuclear power. That goes the same thing in the situation in the Middle East, with Iran, potentially trying to get on that bandwagon. These things matter to the world, and that's an unfortunate reality, why some conflicts get the attention that others don't. And it does often come down to that nuclear capability and whether
That's
that is at the heart of
such a
it.
good
And we're
point.
looking at the same thing with North Korea now.
Well, and I'm hearing Raven, your little girl, in the background, and that's where the president has tried to make this argument. And there's going to be people that disagree with it, including the two next voices we're going to hear, that this had to be done for future generations of Americans not to worry about this, not to worry about a terrorist state getting a nuclear weapon. That's his argument. There are going to be those, again, you're going to hear from in a moment, that are going to say that wasn't a pending threat. And which one's right? Tough for us from our vantage point to tell you. But this is the debate that's been ongoing for years. Let's hear from the foreign minister of Iran. Surprisingly, there were interviews with Iranian officials, and this transpired over the last, day or so, speaking out about the condition of their country. One of the things the foreign minister said is that there was a process, as you mentioned, Holly, to select another leader. But he's been asked a couple of critical questions. So I'm going to let this soundbite play a little bit and stop and start it. But I want you to hear what he has to say to this first question from ABC News.
President Trump issued a warning overnight, warning the Iranians not to retaliate. He said they better not do that. If they do, we will hit them with a force that has never been seen before. How do you respond?
And we have every right, every legitimate right to defend ourselves. What the United States is doing is an act of aggression. What we are doing is the act of self-defense. There are huge differences between these two. So one should tell, the President of the United States, do not attack, do not, make any aggression against another country. But nobody can tell us that you don't have any right to defend yourselves. We are defending ourselves, whatever it takes, and we see no limit for ourselves to defend our people, to protect our people. Just look, yesterday they struck against a school. So far, 148 girls, students have been killed. And this is a big massacre. This is a war crime. And you say we don't have any right to defend ourselves?
Let me just stop there, Holly, because I know that's a story that has a lot of interest on our social media channels as well, which is one of the main stories that's come out of Iran is a report of a girls' school being hit and there being, many, many casualties. Can you provide some perspective? I'm sure you've seen the reporting on it. What are the limits of the information that we have? What should we consider when we see these headlines or even hear the foreign minister talk about that?
So right now, we don't actually know a lot. Both the Israelis and the US have neither confirmed nor denied that their bombs were responsible for that. There was a military base close to that school, so it certainly is highly possible that it was, an incorrect target or that the target was missed. I am sure that's being investigated right now. Again, it's very highly possible that did come from the US or Israel, as certainly as I've seen in other countries that I've worked in, Iraq, Afghanistan. There are targets that are incorrect or targets that hit the wrong place close by. There's things that happen, unfortunately. But there also is the possibility, which we don't know yet either, that it was an Iranian, missile that they were trying to retaliate, and it didn't go where it needed to go and hit a school close by. If you remember, after the death of Qasem Soleimani at the beginning of 2020, Iran tried to retaliate then, and they shot down a Ukrainian airliner that killed hundreds of people. So they don't have very up-to-date, sort of targeting weapons systems. They're very old. Again, a lot of these date back to the 1970s, to the Shah era. So I think in any way, shape, or form, it's just horrific. Unfathomable, that this happened. And my heart goes out to those families and those victims in any case. But I guess if we are going to sort of play that blame game, we just don't have enough information yet.
Just for everyone, notice that reporting, no matter what source that I'm seeing, will always say Iran says, and then the following. So know that it's really being placed directly on Iran's description. So we just need to consider that. And there's no way for us to validate or verify the video or photographs. And this is where we see the lack of diplomatic relations with Iran also come into focus. We don't have independent journalists like Holly roaming the country. A lot of them, they're not allowed to behave in that way under this sort of closed regime. So having someone there to independently verify anything is almost impossible right now. So it's just something to keep in mind. But Holly, I think you really mapped out both sides there really well. So thank you for that. It's such a difficult story. I do have a question from Tanya, who was asking, was the school positioned near a military target by Iran on purpose? And have you seen that before, where schools are placed close to military targets because it provides a little bit of cover? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that is not that's not it's not uncommon, put it that way. I mean, I think we certainly have seen a lot of that with different groups in the Middle East, positioning military equipment, military personnel, sometimes right in the school itself, not even just close to it. So that is not an uncommon thing. It's typically something that you won't see happening in the United States or in most parts of Europe, but it's something that you do see in the Middle East. And I can't sort of speak exactly to Iran to say that, it was a deliberate choice, but it's certainly it's certainly common, that happens.
As you mentioned, terrible to think about that, but important to have some perspective, because these headlines are very emotional and people do care. And we want to make sure that we're very clear about our limits of explanation. Let me go ahead and play the rest. George Stephanopoulos of ABC then challenges the Iranian foreign minister on saying he's trying to protect his people. So take a listen to this.
You say you want to protect your people, but your own regime, according to the estimates we've seen over the last several months, is responsible for the killing of up to 30,000 of Iranian citizens.
Well, we have already answered this accusation. Let me to explain. We were faced with a terrorist operation. It was first protesters, demonstrations, which was legal. According to our constitutions, our people have the right to protest and to go for gatherings and demonstrations. They did it from 28 December to 7 January. We had legal protests. Everything was fine and nobody was killed. And then on 8 January to 10, we faced with a terrorist operation. Armed elements were added to this question, and they started to shoot at our police forces, our security forces, and then they started to shoot at ordinary people, even to protesters. Why? Because they wanted to increase the number of deaths. Since the President of the United States had already said that if there are killings, he would come to rescue. So they wanted to actually drag him to this question. So they started to kill people.
Apologies for the audio there, but there was no way to really cut around that. I wanted you to hear exactly what he was describing. He also went on to say that they actually have audio recordings of the Mossad and of the United States talking about this. He didn't share those audio recordings, Holly, that this was all part of an infiltration. The protests that were widely publicized around the world as rejecting the current regime and being over the economy and a whole host of other issues was really fomented by the West. And so when you hear the foreign minister say that, what comes to mind?
I mean, that's sort of the oldest tactic in the playbook for autocratic regimes, is suddenly that everybody that is sort of standing up against them is, a proxy of the West and a terrorist, and that's their justification they use. You see that very commonly anytime there's any sort of uprising. Majority of Iranian society is definitely not armed. I will say that there is armed minority groups, in Iran, but it would be very, very small kind of percentage of that. And I can't speak to sort of exactly, what their role was in these demonstrations, but but certainly Iran has used the sort of the blaming the CIA, blaming the Mossad tactic anytime there is some sort of uprising against them.
Interesting to know that that's a description that doesn't sound unusual to you. And we're going to take the foreign minister for what he has to say, but also understand the context behind that as well. Ben Rhodes was a deputy national security advisor for President Obama. As many of you likely know, the Obama administration was part of a negotiated deal with Iran to abandon their nuclear program in partnership with some European nations. There was immediate skepticism about this deal, whether or not it would actually keep Iran from developing nuclear weapons or just appease them, and if this was a game of a timeline. I just wanted you to have a little bit of that background, because some view that agreement that the Obama administration put in place as a victory, and others view it, quite frankly, as fraudulent. And President Trump removed the United States from this particular deal during his first term, which was criticized, obviously, by those that were part of the deal. Now, these members of the Obama administration have built a really interesting media network. I've talked about this before. Pod Save America is part of it. It's Crooked Media. And the former group of the administration puts together a variety of different shows. I actually find it very insightful to understand the thinking of critics of President Trump, but also where the Democratic Party is. And so I was listening to it this morning, and Ben Rhodes was speaking about what he believes is going on. And his voice will represent the voice of some Americans. So I want to make sure we include this in our report as well. So let's take a listen.
War is illegal domestically and internationally. The war is unnecessary as a matter of timing. The threats that they're pointing to do nothing to explain. I mean, the fact that in that litany that Trump gave, he was talking about roadside bombs in Iraq 10 years ago. Is that a reason to go to war now? I mean, obviously those are terrible things that happen, but it's an absurd reason to launch a war now. The only new pretext they developed is this ICBM threat, which is totally false. Iran has long had an ICBM program. It cannot hit the United States with an ICBM, is nowhere near being able to do that, and doesn't have a nuclear weapon. And so it matters that this is being done under false pretenses with very little public support and no legal basis. But the reality is that we are in this, and the world is going to see, whatever happens in Iran next, they're going to see as the responsibility of the United States and Donald Trump personally. And as we talked about, whether it's civil conflict, refugee flows into other countries, major energy disruptions in the Straits of Hormuz, periods of calm followed by periods of dramatic violence. I mean, this could go all kinds of ways. But the one thing we know is that Iran is now added to that list of forever wars, and it's the biggest country yet.
What do you think about that, Holly? Are we at the beginning of a forever war? How would we assess that?
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of punditry out there, Jenna, of everybody writing the op-eds, having their opinions about what is next, what's going to happen, what this looks like in 10 years. The reality is we just don't know. We don't know. We don't know. It could be that the regime falls quite quickly. Someone else comes to place, and suddenly Iran is a different and open society. Could also be that, the conflict just kind of continues. You've got Gulf states involved. It could be chaos and an absolute mess that we look back on and think, oh my gosh, this was such a terrible step to take. And then it could just be somewhere in between that. So I want to avoid too much speculation, because none of us can make that judgment call.
Sometimes just hearing that, though, is actually helpful, Holly, to know that we don't have a crystal ball as to where this goes from here. Ben Rhodes is bringing up a question about whether or not the conflict is legal. I covered this in our previous podcast, but just in case everyone missed it, the president has the ability, it doesn't matter if they're a Democrat or Republican, to act unilaterally as a commander-in-chief and in the national interest. So if the president feels that there's a national security risk to the American people, he can act unilaterally. And at a certain point, he will have to go back to Congress for either an authorization of use of military force or a declaration of war. But right now, even though it's been debated in the past about what are the capabilities unilaterally of the president, the past precedent would suggest that he has the power to act in this particular way. I don't know what sort of legal challenges would come up that could could disrupt that at this moment. But there's not necessarily like a legal off-ramp, at this exact time. This is ongoing, and Congress will have to be involved at some point. Just so we also get this news in, there are reinforcements apparently heading to the Middle East from American service members and a variety of different forces. We don't know exactly what that looks like. The Department of War wasn't specific for obvious reasons. A name that's come up over the last several weeks, Holly, as far as someone that could help shepherd Iran to the next chapter, whatever that is a name, Reza Pahlavi. I'm just going to put it on the screen for our audience because they may recognize him from social media. Can you tell us a little bit about who this is?
Yes. And just to your other point, I just want to add that the US does not have endless munitions. So initially the war was going to be 4 days because that was the sort of estimated stockpile of what the US was capable of. I believe that's increased now to 4 weeks. But, unless they can kind of get mass things kind of shipped over there, the sort of the forever war label isn't really sticking right now because the supply just isn't there. So that's also something that needs to be considered logistically.
Very good point. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And then in terms of Reza Pahlavi, so obviously he's got a very strong connection to Iran. His dad was the Shah, but he hasn't been to the country since he was 17 years old, since they fled in the late 70s. And so there is a lot of mixed feelings, I suppose. There is certainly a romanticism of the Shah. But at the same time, people kind of see him as an outside figure that doesn't really have a direct connection to Iran, therefore not really able to kind of mobilize that popularity. And, even the Shah's legacy is incredibly tainted too. We tend to really only hear one side of it in the West, but this was actually a project I worked on several years ago with people who were also victims of the Shah. And remember, it was, something of an autocratic society, back then as well. So there were a huge range of human rights abuses that did happen under the Shah. So it is a tarnished legacy, depending on who you speak to. But I do think that while Reza has kind of amassed a name in the West, I don't, necessarily see that translating. And I think that one of the reasons that the president sort of held off a little bit in kind of going after the Iranian leadership was because of concern of who can be considered to be somewhat of a legitimate interim leader. Because Iran does not allow any sort of opposition, within Iran. So any of these figures cropping up, typically work from the diaspora. So that does make it hard for them to, I guess, have some sort of legitimate ruling over a country that they haven't been to for most of their lives.
But what do you think about that, like the possibility of the next leadership? And by the way, we actually don't know if that could happen. The president has been very clear that it's up to the Iranian people. And quite frankly, if the regime holds on, we could go through this entire conflict, whatever that is, and still end up with the same regime at the head. I mean, that's still very much on the table.
Yeah. And this is the problem, is that obviously, the US doesn't want to look like it is putting a leadership in place in a sovereign, independent country. But in Iran, there is no viable opposition for the people to just suddenly choose, and who is able to kind of stand up and take that role. While there still is an armed, an armed IRGC, an armed military, a huge majority of that country, has been loyal to this regime militarily. I'm not saying most of the country is not for the regime, but it's very hard to just kind of stand up and take control when this is what you're faced with. So I just think that is a little bit of a hurdle. I understand it from sort of the public relations point of view, but I don't really know how Iranians are going to be able to do that while the IRGC and these other elements are still in place. And you haven't seen a huge amount of defections over the last couple of days. That just hasn't happened. So that, does inform me that the regime is, is still very much in place, even though a lot of the leadership is now gone. And that's going to be the big challenge. And I think, people kind of look at it and try to compare it to Venezuela and say, well, is there like a Darcy Rodriguez that can sort of take the helm, that, still can work with the US, but still sort of belongs to the old guard? And that is just much more murky in Iran than it was in Venezuela.
Interesting. I think it's easy for us to pontificate about, like, well, who could that person be that could rise to the occasion? We're thinking that, just superimposing ourselves in Iran, if you don't have internet access, the entire internet is apparently not usable in Iran right now. You're worried about the safety of your family. There hasn't been an ability for open debate or even discussion about what a new government could look like, because you could be thrown in prison. Like, that's a lot to try to create in a moment's notice. And one wonders, like, who would be able to step up in that particular way? Would you have to be a celebrity of sorts or a business person that the country knows about?
Yeah.
Otherwise, how would anyone even know what direction to move in? Ben Rhodes did bring, I want to get your thoughts on this in your time in the country, Holly. Ben Rhodes was saying, we don't even know, these people that are out in the rural areas of Iran, they all, he wasn't saying it this way. I'm generalizing what he's saying. They're supporting the Ayatollah. Like, they're not in that interest. We may be overestimating how interested they are in new leadership. What did you see? How long were you in the country? What did you see while you were there? I know you couldn't have a lot of frank conversations with people about this because you could get in trouble. But what was your sense about how people, outside Tehran felt about the regime?
Yeah, I mean, I would say based on, research, and I think sort of the latest studies, about 80% of the population were against the regime. And so their base sort of 20%, which is still significant, were loyal to the regime. And I tend to kind of agree that that's probably correct. You tend to see in the bigger cities like Tehran, where there will be stronger, opposition, I guess, and maybe some of the more rural areas, maybe a little bit more conservative or religious, and kind of less inclined. But I think what we really saw in the protests this year was just how widespread that for the first time, these protests started in rural areas. They didn't start in the cities. They started in very small, parts and pockets of the country that typically don't get involved in these protests. And that's what really made them different. And certainly when I was there, it was just every conversation that you sort of had. And Iran is a very young population too, and big dreams, unemployment is very high, and yet people are very educated, they have degrees and can't find jobs. So it's very frustrating. But everywhere you went, people wanted to engage with you. They wanted to find out what you thought. They wanted to let you know that Iranian people don't dislike Westerners, that, they wanted to ask you questions. Well, how can I move to Australia? How can I get out? And people, I was surprised actually how unafraid people were to kind of want to tell you these things and want you to know that they weren't supportive of this religious regime. And I was, obviously a little bit more hesitant to engage too much in it, just to not sort of put a marker on my head. But people were very fed up with the situation that they were handed. And I was yet to encounter, in my time of meeting different people there, there was no one that I felt came across in any way, shape, or form as kind of supportive of the regime. So
interesting. How long were you there, Holly? How many weeks were you there?
About 3 weeks. Yeah, just under a month. So
and traveling alone, what was your kind of route through the country? What did you follow?
Yeah, so I went to Tehran first, and then I went to Yazd and Isfahan, and kind of traveled around, and then to Shiraz and Tabriz. So I took a lot of overnight buses and trains, and so it's about a lot
And did
of
you
time.
feel safe traveling under your Australian passport?
I didn't know that I could say that I felt totally safe. I mean, being a journalist and all, but yeah, I was a bit nervous, but I think, but yeah, safety wise, I felt relatively safe. But yeah, certainly, very on guard, very exhausted when I got home. A friend of mine who picked me up from the airport, I remember he dropped me off at my apartment in New York at the time, and I think I just slept for 48 hours. And it wasn't exhaustion just from flying; it was just the mental exhaustion of just having to sort of feel so on guard kind of the whole time. And just
what did you learn from that experience, and what do you think is missing from our conversation because so many people have never stepped foot inside the country?
I think it isn't Iran is, first of all, just sort of an incredible country with incredible history and incredible diversity of places and things to do, and incredibly hospitable people, like really just lovely people who they're just very welcoming to outsiders. And I think that, yeah, just sort of seeing that desire, that push for change. I mean, even the ability to stand up, against these armed autocratic regimes, to stand up against your own government, the amount of bravery that takes. And when you see that en masse, in Iran, it's really incredible. And they're lovely people, lovely kind of society. And, there's no real sense of, radicalization or, again, and that's why I have hope for Iran, in the sense that, it is a society that I think has wanted this change for a really long time. That is, an educated society, that is an incredibly brilliant society in terms of, what they're capable of doing and bringing to the world if they have those kind of resources and opportunities. And I think, it is different from other countries that the US has got involved in. And so I really am just holding on to hope for the Iranian people, because I don't see an opportunity like this, coming, again. And I really just hope that this, where we've gotten to so far, I guess, is not all for nothing. Like, that we've come this far, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. We've come this far that it would be heartbreaking to see that terrible regime survive it and go back to the status quo.
And it sounds like you're saying that we really need to keep in mind that the regime and the government doesn't represent the people, and to understand that those are two separate things.
Yes, yes.
But the
And I
past
think
still.
we can say that for any country, to be honest.
That's true. Yes. Yes.
The people are their own people, and yes, a portion may support their government, but the people are not their government, sort of anywhere in the world, and that certainly is the case very flagrantly in Iran.
Yeah, good point. I feel that daily by direct messages and social media.
Yeah.
And everyone, it really doesn't, even people that support the current government may not agree with them on everything. Okay, Holly, I'll let you go, but do you mind just telling us that one story one more time about you getting on the plane and leaving Iran? I just love this story so much. And there could be new audience members. And I just feel like this plays to our, spy novel sort of, questions about your travels. We're always, Holly will say these things and you'll be like, Holly, tell me more about that, about those overnight bus rides in Iran, or like getting from one part of Afghanistan to the other, or being arrested by the Taliban. And, she kind of just casually mentions it to you. But then this one is just one of my favorite stories that she tells about why there was a mental load traveling home.
Yes.
Please tell us.
So when I was leaving, it was an Emirates flight, I think, to Dubai, and then I was going on to New York from there. But so the seat that I'd picked on the plane, an aisle seat, I think, somewhere. And then when I got sort of my ticket and got on the plane, I realized I was like in a middle seat in the back, which was a bit unusual. I was like, oh, that's strange, but whatever. I was just happy to be going home at that point. And so, as I'm sort of flicking through my phone, looking at some photographs of my trip, and the guy next to me immediately, starts talking to me. He was very well dressed in a suit. I think he said his name was Ali, and then starts asking me all these questions about where I went, who I saw, what I learned, blah, blah, blah. And I just, was very blasé kind of about it, just sort of playing like Aussie backpacker. And sort of and then he kind of kept hammering me when it was very clear I just wasn't in the mood for conversation. So then I just put my headphones in for the rest of the trip and tried to ignore him. And I could see that he was kind of getting a little bit antsy. And whenever I asked him questions like, well, what are you doing in Dubai? He would sort of not really have a great answer and be like, oh, just, I don't know, something. And then I'm going back. So it was very clear to me that he didn't really have any direction for what he was doing. Anyway, so put my headphones in to kind of get him off my back. And then when we landed, I got up and getting my stuff together, and I sort of, he said, okay, well, good luck. It was nice to meet you, Holly. And I said, yeah, good luck to you too, Ali. And I never told you my name. and just kind of left. So that was my last Iran experience.
We're just wondering, where's Ollie now? And was he just a representative of the government asking a few questions of where Holly was going? Or maybe he was just a friendly businessman that didn't know how to just be quiet.
I don't know, happened to know my name, and yeah.
I mean, it's just a while. It's one of those, like I said, it's a great story. I'm obviously glad you're safe. But thinking about Dubai and flying into Dubai, I think those are the sort of news items that haven't got a lot of attention. Dubai is the busiest international airport in the world, and it wasn't functioning this weekend.
Yeah.
That sort of disruption for weeks is a really big one that I don't know if we really can wrap our heads around what that could do to commerce and travel and business. And I'll be curious we didn't get to that. And just a quick question on that. The Gulf states have been attacked by Iran for what Iran says is their relationships or, military bases that we have or positions in these countries. But like the Dubai airport is a pretty bold place to attack. What do you think that means for these Gulf nations and what their tolerance is for Iranian retaliation?
I mean, I think it's a huge shock to them. They certainly haven't experienced it. In Dubai, Abu Dhabi, these have been, these are the hubs now for technology, for AI, for banks. A lot of the big banks, hedge funds, they've all moved their operations to Dubai, sort of on the notion that it is, extremely safe and secure place. And for 99% of the time it is. So this is really the first time they've had to face that very direct threat. So I think that is it's very nerve-wracking for the Gulf countries. And I think it was one of the reasons that they were also sort of in Trump's ear for much of the year about not going through with this bombing campaign because of their, the concerns of a regional spillover and what that would mean for them. But, interestingly enough, this week, it was also revealed that Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia was very privately, pushing Trump into taking action while publicly, pushing for diplomacy. So I think none of these, I think, especially UAE and a lot of the Gulf countries certainly are not sad to see the Iranian regime go, but they have to, they're a lot closer to the action and have to worry about what that means for their economies, as I've seen this weekend.
Yeah, for sure. What do you think about the European countries and their reaction so far, like Germany, France, and England as well? This very specific support for the United States, but also we're not getting involved here sort of situation and their posturing. What do you make of that from Europe?
Yeah, I think it's probably, maybe a lot of the same concerns that the Democrats have about the legalities of it, about why now, about if this was a chronic problem, why are we treating it like an acute problem? But I don't think, being just sort of natural allies to the United States, that this is going to in any way insulate these European countries. As we saw, France, Macron came out early yesterday and was sort of speaking out against it. Mind you, France is in negotiations with Iran because they have hostages there. So he was probably being quite mindful of that. The next thing you know, the French base in Abu Dhabi gets hit. The same thing with, British base in Cyprus was targeted. So even though these leaders might come out and say that they're not for the attacks, that is not going to insulate them from becoming targets, which in a way is maybe sort of a strange tactical move by the Iranians, because people that could have potentially, stayed neutral on it are going to just by default now move to the American side because you attacked them. And that's sort of, so Iran is amassing enemies, I guess, with its arbitrary approach.
That would be a space to watch. And so it's actually a good place to end on, which is watch our allies, see if they get more involved. Do they send any sort of other support than statements? What do we see from these Gulf countries as well, as far as tolerance for what this retaliatory attacks look like? What is the endurance? And that was such an interesting way that you put it, Holly, a chronic problem versus an acute problem. And how do you address either? So some different strategies there. Any final thoughts, Holly, before we go, as to what you're looking at this week, or thoughts that maybe we didn't get a chance to cover?
Yeah, I just think obviously we want to keep Iranian people, in our thoughts, that this obviously affects them very directly, and also the military personnel, as we've seen, 4 deaths and some casualties, and this may increase, depending on where things go and the attacks, and it's just that is the hard challenge about war, and the questions that I'm always asking myself is, what is worth it, what is not, and I think it's it's easy to pontificate where we are thousands of miles away, but there's always going to be some form of a collateral damage, and it is hard to answer the question of was it worth it. That's always something that I think we continue to grapple with. And I think, that's just personally for me, why I off my journalist cap here a little bit, but why it would be a little bit heartbreaking to see that regime survive, given that, people have already, many people have already lost their lives in this operation so far. And I just hope that it can bring about some kind of sustainable and lasting change.
That gives us a lot to think about. Holly, as always, thank you. I'm sure we'll see you again soon. I hope Holly will be helping us with our reporting over the next several weeks as we work through this. Holly, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Smarter News. Always love coming.
It's such a unique perspective, and we're so grateful for Holly and for her expertise and her understanding and her ability to express the many points of view that you have to hold at the same time as you're looking at a story like this. And it's anxiety it's natural anxiety that we want to know, well, what does this all mean? Where is this all going? And that is war. It is chaos. And we don't know where this story is going. And anyone that says that they do, we should, keep that in mind as we're listening to their perspective. As Holly was talking about something being worth it, I was thinking about my husband reflecting on his military service. And obviously he has lost friends in combat. And I've asked him that question, was it worth it? And every few years there's a broader reflection. I wouldn't say every few years. I mean, if someone has gone to war, it's with them every single day. It doesn't change. And I didn't have a lot of experience in a military family before I met my husband. So I understand sort of these two worlds of being connected to a military operation and not being connected at all. And this education has been so important to me as a journalist, because I also realize how little representation military families or perspective has in the press, because usually the press doesn't have a lot of exposure there. And there's not people like Holly that are embedded or traveling independently in war zones to try to, have some sort of observation as to what's taking place. And that question of being worth it, my husband will always say, it's never worth it. Someone's life is never worth it. The question is, was it right? Were you doing the right thing? And that can also be debated. That doesn't make the question easier. It just makes it a little bit different. And that may be the question that is also being grappled with in this highly complicated situation. Is it right? Is what America is doing now correct or not? Legally, morally, ethically, as on behalf of the American people. And that's a question that we probably can't answer at this exact moment, but you may have an idea about. I'm going to leave you with a comment from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He, again, was part of this press conference that we started with. And I think his message here at the end is an important one to hear, because he's directly talking to our adversaries, but then he's talking to you, the American people. I know all of our audience isn't just the American people, by the way. I've loved that we have a lot of people from around the world now listening to Smarter News, and I welcome your opinions and your thoughts, and it's great to have your perspective. I read every single comment, and it matters. But this messaging is a mark in time. I'm not sharing this message because of support for the administration. This is a moment where he is speaking directly to you. And what we're going to watch for is whether or not that messaging changes, even over the next week, as there is more political pressure, public pressure, or questions about the way ahead. And those questions will surely come for the White House and those in power. So we'll definitely have a lot more news to get to this week. And I'm glad to be able to experience this time with you. So as I let you go off to the rest of your day, I look forward to your questions, your comments. We'll have more on smartnews.com. You can always direct message us, audio message us your questions. We'll collect those and we'll use them for future podcasts because I love hearing your voice and I want to make the news work for you again. So we answer the questions that you actually have, not just the questions that we want to report on. There's enough of that out there with agenda and news. And as a nonpartisan news organization, our whole goal is the basics: who, what, where, when, how, and why, and to get your questions answered. Because we work for you. That's what a free press is actually supposed to do, is work on behalf of a free people to get them the answers that they need in order to make up their own minds so then they can impact those in power and the way forward. That's what the free press is all about. All right, here is General Kane with some final thoughts, and I look forward to spending more time with you throughout the week. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you soon.
Those who would test our resolve or threaten the United States, our allies, or our interests, understand clearly we can reach you, we can sustain the fight, and we can scale the fight, and we will prevail. To the American people, your joint force remains steady, frosty, calm, and focused. Your service members are trained, disciplined, and determined. We understand the risks of this mission and the weight of the responsibility that we carry. We also recognize that our families also shoulder the burden at home. You are a part of this too. I am proud today, as I am every day, to stand as a member of America's joint force. There is no mission too complex, no distance too great, and no adversary too determined for the men and women who wear our nation's uniform. We mourn our fallen, we honor their families, and we continue our mission with focus, unity, and strength.